All right, so this is the start of Unit 7. This is our last unit in American History 1. So this whole unit is Reconstruction. This isn't a super long period of time. We've covered larger units. This really isn't a big unit in general. It's just specifically about the journey that we take after the Civil War, rebuilding our country physically, as well as, fixing the economy and trying to improve the situation of people in the South, African Americans all over the country, and things like that, and the sort of backlash that also comes from that, from trying to force the South back into this mold that they didn't want to be a part of. So this is not a super long unit. Your test for this unit will be on December 1st, so the Thursday after Thanksgiving break. So literally we will just be covering it today and tomorrow, and then the Monday and Tuesday after Thanksgiving break. So like I said, not a long unit at all, only 4 days, and then we'll review it all the day after. So not a whole lot here, so let's jump right in. So there's a lot of issues to take into consideration when we're talking about Reconstruction. Reconstruction is literally a program implemented by the federal government between 1865 and 1877 to repair the damage to the South caused by the Civil War and to restore the Southern states to the Union. It's not so simple as saying, okay, the war is over, we're all part of the Union again. A lot of stuff has happened in the time that the Civil War's been going on, and the idea that the South has seceded is still very difficult for a lot of people in the North to handle, and the idea that the South is now part of the United States is difficult for a lot of people in the South to handle. So there's a lot of different views to sort of balance here. When the process of Reconstruction begins, there's a lot of issues to take into consideration. Number one, how are states supposed to rejoin the Union? Some people feel that Confederate leaders are guilty of treason and that they should be tried for treason. And if you remember, I've said before, the punishment and the consequence for treason is, death. So ultimately, they felt that main Confederate leaders, military and government-wise, should all be executed. Others feel like they should be pardoned so that we can sort of begin this process of healing, because it's not necessarily for everyone about punishing the South. It's just about sort of trying to move on. This also brings up the question of when will Southern congressmen be able to retake their seats? All those senators and everyone from South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, all these places who have seceded and not been in Congress for the last 5 years are now going to start popping back up. How is that supposed to sort of go on? The Constitution says nothing about secession, and it says nothing about readmitting states who have seceded. So whatever happens from this point on, the government is going to be just making it up as they go. So no one even knows who's supposed to be in charge of the process of Reconstruction. Is it Congress's job to handle Reconstruction? Is it the president's job to handle Reconstruction? Nobody really knows. So some people thought that the Southern states should just be allowed to rejoin the Union, but under certain conditions. A popular condition was the idea of having all of the citizens, or at least some citizens, take a loyalty oath. Other people thought that they should have to amend their state constitution to protect the rights of African Americans, things like that. The second issue that we have to consider with Reconstruction is the Southern economy. Remember, during the Civil War unit that we just finished, we talked a lot about what was happening to the South towards the end of the war, and basically every problem that Confederacy was experiencing was because of a poor economy. We talked about inflation, hyperinflation, scarcity, low manufacturing, low food production, the embargo, so no trade, the blockade, so no trade. So it's just a lot of problems. So the Union Army, mostly Sherman, right, because he was basically Satan, but the Union Army has destroyed factories, railroads, plantations all throughout the South. So aside from the fact that the South hasn't been really in a good situation economically for the last couple of years, really, now they don't even have the facilities to sort of lift themselves back up because all of that has been destroyed during the war. And in the South, a fourth of all Southern men between the ages of 20 and 40 died during the war. That is an incredibly high number, and it's very alarming. That is a fourth of a generation in the South was totally lost during the war. And that's something that's really going to affect people emotionally. There are now nearly 3 million former slaves in the South that need jobs and need homes, and they don't know how to live in a society that is attempting to begin to put more responsibility on them. So it's just a very tricky situation. Southern land was pretty much the only asset they had left. So a lot of people were arguing over who technically had the right to control it. Some people wanted land to be distributed among freedmen and their families. So a lot of former slaves, some people thought, let's take some of this land that the South has and start giving it to former slaves so they can either start their own families, start their own farms, do whatever they need to try to help lift them up and give them a chance to advance themselves economically. William Tecumseh Sherman actually suggested a plan called 40 Acres and a Mule. If you've ever heard of that, he argued that we should literally give 40 acres of land and a mule to every African American in the South, or basically to every African American family. That doesn't happen, but it was a fairly popular idea. Southern landowners obviously strongly object to that idea that the government could take away their property, because in their mind, they've already taken away their slaves. Taking away their physical land is just going to cause them more problems. And even Northerners, for the most part, agreed that confiscating property violated the Constitution and it wasn't acceptable. Even a lot of freedmen didn't feel like they should just be given the property. A lot of people felt that the government should maybe buy the land from the South, and then sell it to former slaves for very cheap prices. The economy is an important thing. And then the third major thing to consider here is, what role are African Americans supposed to play in the South, in the North, in the United States, in the government, in the economy, in society? What is their role? So the 13th Amendment was passed. I told you it was ratified in December of 1865, and it ended slavery, but it does not grant full citizenship to African Americans. So now we need to address voting rights, access to education, access to health care, things like that. So free blacks in the North, they didn't have these rights either. This wasn't something that was just affecting black people in the South. This was black people everywhere were not considered citizens. Like Dred Scott, it didn't matter that he was a slave. Black people literally did not have citizenship according to the federal government of the United States. So they did not have access to things like that. The Republican Party was still the dominating force in the federal government by this time, because the South had been gone for so long. The Democratic Party was so small, and it's going to take years for the Democratic Party to actually come all the way back in and get all of the Southern congressmen and everyone back into Congress, all those Democrats back. And then on top of that, it'll take a long time for them to really start gaining some power back. So the Republicans want to extend full citizenship to African Americans, but the Southerners and former slave owners really didn't want this, because they thought it would damage or lower their own power and status in society, which sort of sounds like a major fear sort of white people this whole time, right? Now, Lincoln had his own plan for Reconstruction. Obviously, we know that he's not going to be able to actually carry it out, because he's going to be assassinated, that April. But he does, even way before the end of the Civil War, back in 1863, he already sort of had, the confidence that the war would be over and it would eventually end in the Union's favor, and that he would need some sort of plan on how exactly they would want the South to rejoin the Union. And also by 1863, some Southern states were occupied by Union armies, or at least pieces of them were. So, there needed to be a plan on how those areas that were occupied by Union militaries were supposed to be treated. So Lincoln came up with his own plan. It was called the 10% plan. Now, Lincoln had always felt sympathy for the South, and he wanted them to rejoin the Union, right? He didn't really care, honestly, about slavery. He didn't really care about states' rights. He just didn't. He understood that there was, as far as not necessarily the government, but as far as citizens and civilians in the South go, that there was the trust between the federal government and the citizens in the South was totally broken. And he knew that, and he wanted to repair that and get some loyalty back and some trust back. And all he ever wanted was to preserve the Union. So he wants it to be easy to just come back into the Union. That was his thought process. So he created the 10% plan in 1863, and it said that if only 10% of a state state's voters took the oath of loyalty to the United States, then a state could be readmitted to the Union and start setting up their new state government again. And then if they wrote their new constitution, and in the new constitution abolished slavery and provided a plan to educate African Americans in their state, then they could send their congressman back. So super easy. Two things they got to do: get 10% of your people, of your really your voters, to take the oath, which isn't many at all, and then on top of that, write a constitution outlawing slavery and providing education. So not a difficult thing. He also wants to actually grant pardons to all the Confederate leaders. He's sort of like a forgive and forget, let's move on type of guy. So he's trying to really move past this. He also considered compensation for any lost property, whether that meant slaves or land that might have been destroyed during the war, things like that. He didn't want to require political and social equality for blacks from each state, because he thought that that would be asking too much. If we ask every state to, as soon as you join the Union, provide African Americans with the right to vote and the right to run for public office, and the same social status as white people, that they would resist even more and it would cause more problems. So he didn't even want that. It's important to remember that Lincoln saw the Union as unbreakable. So in his mind, the South never really left. This is just where we've stopped fighting. We never broke up. We were just arguing. And now in his mind, the argument is over and we're trying to sort of make up. So, he even said in one of his more famous speeches, with malice towards none and charity for all. Malice is sort of like bad intentions, bad feelings. He's saying, I've got, basically saying no hard feelings towards the South. The radical Republicans, who are dominating Congress at this point, obviously the Congress is pretty much like, I would say, I don't know, like 90, 80%, 75% Republican. Like, it's overwhelmingly Republicans because the Democrats have been gone for so long. But there's even another sect inside of the Republican Party that is what we would call radical Republicans. These are the abolitionists and the people who believe in like social and political equality for African Americans, and people like Thaddeus Stevens, who we'll talk about later. But those guys we would call radical Republicans. And the radical Republicans do not like Lincoln's plan. Now, Lincoln is a Republican, remember, so this is his own party. The radical Republicans do not like Lincoln's plan. They think that he is too soft. The radical Republicans were being led by Thaddeus Stevens, who I just mentioned, and then also Charles Sumner, if you remember him, who got beat up by Preston Brooks while he's still in Congress doing his thing. Can't really see because he got beat up so bad, but he's doing his best. So he's also a radical Republican. In the minds of radical Republicans, the Confederates had committed a crime. They had committed treason, and they have to pay for that. You can't just say forgive and forget. So they wanted the South to grant full citizenship rights to African Americans, including the right to vote. They thought that Confederate leaders should face punishment. And they supported William Sherman's plan, the 40 acres and a mule thing. They were really behind. They also actually wrote something called the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill was written in 1864, before the end of the war, and it said that it would require a majority of the state's voters to swear a loyalty oath to the Union, not just 10% like Lincoln wanted. And it also wanted the political equality of African Americans in that state. Lincoln did not like this plan. He thought it was going to cause way more problems in the future, and it wasn't going to really preserve the Union the way he wanted. It wasn't going to end the war. It wasn't going to make the South feel part of the Union and part of the United States again. So this wasn't what he wanted. So when a bill comes to the president's desk, technically he has two options, right? He can sign it or he can veto it. But actually, there's sort of a third option, which is to do nothing. If you do nothing, eventually the bill will die, and that's called a pocket veto, and it will go back to Congress, and they will have to work on it again. And that's what Lincoln does with the Wade-Davis bill. He basically kills it with a pocket veto because he didn't want to veto it and piss off his own party, but he didn't want to sign it because he thought that it was going to be way too complicated.